Their life was like a fairy tale, but unfortunately, their story had not had a happy ending. Shauna in Castleton was born in 1966 in Salt Lake City, Utah, USA. She had an older sister, Paula, with whom they were very close throughout their lives. In 1994, at the age of 28, Shauna decided to move to the city of her dreams, Las Vegas. For the girl, it was a city of great opportunities. At first, she worked as a salesperson in a cosmetics store, but she strove for the best. Shauna was attracted by the nightlife of the city where there was money, success, and wealth. Her dream came true when the girl was hired as a waitress in one of the best casinos in Las Vegas, Palms. Thanks to her beautiful appearance, Shauna was very sociable. She quickly got used to work and made friends. Colleagues became a second family for her. Shauna always smiled, shone, and was in a good mood. Her relatives called her Barbie for her blonde hair and beautiful appearance. Shauna really liked this job, and clients adored her. The girl earned well, about $100,000 a year. The Palms Casino gave her not only friends and wealth, but also love. It was in 2002 that Shauna met her future husband, George Tiafe. It was love at first sight. George was handsome, charismatic, and charming. George was a great guy at that time. He worked as a firefighter and helped people. The man was close to his family. Every month, he sent money home to help his mother take care of his younger sister, who was disabled. George's photos were printed in the firefighter's calendar. Because of his handsome appearance, together they were a beautiful, bright couple and loved each other very much. After their first meeting, they became inseparable and soon began to live together. A year later, they had a daughter who was named Madison. The daughter became the meaning of life for Shauna. She was engaged in raising the girl and the house, and her husband worked as a firefighter. 3 years later, they got married in Hawaii on the ocean shore. It was a beautiful, cozy ceremony for only the closest ones. Their life was like a fairy tale, but this story will not have a happy ending. 2 years later, the family began to have problems. George failed with his financials and lost a lot of money in the real estate market. Shauna had to go back to work and become the main breadwinner in the family. Her husband hardly worked and fell into depression. He did not like the situation, but at that time he could not cope with financial difficulties. The man began to make claims to his wife for her appearance at work. He was against Shauna dressing so revealingly and became jealous of her, but Shauna could not dress differently for her work. The tension between them increased. The situation worsened when George became friends with the homeless man and began inviting him home. Shauna found him creepy. He scared her. George had helped the homeless before, but before he had not brought them home, and now her husband crossed the line. Shauna was fed up with such antics of her husband. She could not stand it, and for safety reasons for herself and her daughter, after almost 10 years of marriage, she moved into her apartment in a townhouse. Shauna was devastated by this situation. Those close to her saw how she was worried about the breakup of the family. The woman was an optimist in life and hoped to save the marriage. Her husband was also against the divorce. They tried to save the family and began to visit a family psychologist, but unfortunately, this did not help in any way. The couple had too many grievances and mutual claims against each other, so Shauna decided to get a divorce. They began to share custody of their daughter in court. Shauna threw herself into work. Her only joys in life were her daughter and work, where she forgot about family problems. One day in early September 2012, when she came back from work, she noticed that someone was in the house. There was a mess everywhere. Some valuables, including her engagement ring, were stolen. The strange thing was that along with the valuables, her bikini was stolen. The thief left a pair of small-sized boxes in the apartment. It was strange and did not at all look like a robbery as the police thought. Shauna was frightened by this invasion of her home, but decided not to panic and let the situation go. But by an evil irony of fate, just 3 weeks later, someone returned to her house, and this time for a reason. On September 29, 2012, Shauna left work as usual around 3 a.m. At 3:30, she pulled up to the house, parked her car in the garage, and entered the apartment, and no one saw her alive again. In the morning, when George's shift ended, he dropped off to pick up his 8-year-old daughter Madison from her grandmother. The man picked her up and they headed to Shauna's for the children's things. The garage door was suspiciously open, as was the door to the apartment. Upon entering the apartment, they noticed that there was a mess. Some things were scattered, and on the floor lay Shauna's lifeless body in a pool of blood. The husband called 911 and reported the terrible discovery in the house. The police immediately arrived at the scene of the crime. The attack on Shauna was brutal. Her skull was broken so hard and deep that the police medics initially assumed that she had been shot, but the medical examiner determined that the deceased had been attacked with a hammer and she had received such a wound from the blow. Her fingers were broken. The woman desperately tried to defend herself, but could not overcome the attacker. She was brutally beaten until she stopped showing signs of life. In total, she received 17 blows with a hammer. The first suspect was the husband. He found Shauna's body and they were getting a divorce. But it turned out that the husband had an ironclad alibi. George was at work at the time of the crime. He had worked a 24-hour shift. His colleagues and CCTV footage confirmed this. Then the husband was excluded from the list of suspects. A neighbor told investigators that he heard some strange sounds coming from her apartment at night, but did not attach any importance to it because Shauna always returned home at night. Another neighbor found the murdered woman's documents, her phone and cosmetics near the house, so he handed them over to the police. Detectives knew that someone had previously broken into Shauna's apartment, stolen valuables, and left their underwear. This seemed strange to the police. Even then, they began to consider this version. Shauna was a very beautiful, spectacular woman, so she could have had an obsessed admirer who stalked Shauna. This could explain the theft of her underwear, or she became an accidental victim of a burglar who broke into her house at the wrong time. And when the woman returned home, he had to get rid of her as an unwanted witness. This could explain why Shauna's things were found near the house. The robber could have stolen some valuables and lost these things while running away. But it turned out that no valuables were missing from Shauna's house. This excluded the version of an unsuccessful robbery. Shauna's colleagues were frightened by her murder and feared that her stalker could switch on them. Investigators took for examination the recordings from the surveillance cameras from her work to check whether someone was following her. But from the recordings, they determined that no one was stalking Shauna, and this version was also questioned. Shauna's sister Paula, having learned of the tragedy, flew with her husband to Las Vegas to help the investigation. She believed that everything was much simpler. Paula immediately told the police that she knew who was behind this crime. The woman suspected Shauna's husband. In her opinion, it was George who either committed the murder himself or involved someone. At this time, the police received a tip that a homeless man had blabbed about how he had beaten a woman to death with a hammer. At first, no one believed him, but when rumors of Shauna's brutal murder with a hammer began to spread around the city, his words were taken more seriously. The police found the homeless man at the store where he usually stole food. He had illegal substances with him. This became a good reason for his arrest. It turned out that the homeless man's name was Noel Stevens. He had previously been convicted of petty crimes, but he denied having anything to do with Shauna's murder. The police went to the tent where he lived. They could hardly find it in the desert and found a lot of interesting things there. Next to his tent lay bloody jeans. They were sent to the lab. DNA testing confirmed the investigators' suspicions that the blood belonged to Shauna, and on the jeans themselves was the suspect's DNA. A receipt for a purchase from a store was also found in the trousers. The police requested recordings from CCTV cameras from that store at the specified time, and it turned out that it was Noel who was the buyer and paid for the hammer and boxes at the checkout. When checking his phone in the contact list, the police found the only contact of George, with whom they called 87 times, and it turned out that it was none other than George Tiafe, the husband of the murdered Shauna. This homeless man was the friend of George who visited his house and scared his wife. The woman was not in vain afraid of him and moved out of the house. Noel confirmed that George from the contact list was his friend Fireman. The police looked at the video surveillance records from the store again to find how the homeless man could have got to the store, and it turned out that Noel arrived there by car with another man. They walked around the store together and chose goods. This man, of course, was Shauna's husband. The whole picture came together like a puzzle. George persuaded the homeless man's friend to help him get rid of his wife. George helped him prepare for the crime, told him what time his wife would arrive home, and chose a good day when he would be on duty, thereby providing himself with an alibi and removing suspicion from himself. George hoped to commit the perfect crime that would not be solved, but he miscalculated. The police told the homeless man about all the evidence against him, and he, under pressure from the evidence, confessed that he had killed Shauna. Noel confirmed that George wanted her dead and paid him $600. And after the execution, promised to pay another tens of thousands of dollars when he received his wife's insurance. Then the motive of the crime became clear to the police: money. According to Noel, he and George had been planning this crime for a long time and staged a robbery of Shauna's apartment 3 weeks in advance to mislead the detectives and send the trail down the wrong path. Noel idolized George for helping him for many years and being his best friend, so he agreed to help get rid of his wife. Noel told about what happened in the house on the day of the crime. He got into Shauna's apartment while she was not home with the help of a spare key that George gave him and was waiting for her. When he heard that the apartment door opened, he put on a mask and hid. He began to wait for the right moment. When Shauna began to climb to the second floor, he came out of hiding and attacked her from behind with a hammer. The woman fell. He jumped on her and began to hit with a hammer. Shauna tried to resist. She cried and screamed, and when she saw the face of the attacker, she understood everything. The criminal could no longer leave her alive. Noel hit her with such force that the hammer broke, but this did not stop him. He took the metal part and continued to hit her. The criminal beat the woman to death and ran away from the house without closing the door. Noel showed the place where he hid the hammer. It turned out to be next to the tent of a homeless man. The hammer was really broken. The detectives invited George's mother and sister to talk and told them about his involvement in the murder of his wife. Relatives denied that George could be capable of such a thing. After talking to the police, the sister called the suspect and told him that the investigators knew everything and would come for him soon. The man was in despair. George jumped into the car and rushed at high speed over 100 kilometers per hour and crashed into a barrier. The police believed that at that moment George tried to commit suicide because there were no braking marks on the road. He deliberately caused an accident. George survived this accident but was taken to the hospital for treatment, and after he was arrested for the murder of his wife, and he simply said, "Okay." George and Noel were charged with Shauna's murder, but George was not going to admit to his involvement in his wife's murder. A gun that he had bought after his wife's death was found in George's house. Detectives believed that he probably planned to kill his homeless friend as well, so as not to have to share the insurance money with him and to remove him as a witness at the trial. There was plenty of evidence against Noel Stevens, and he also pleaded guilty, so his trial was quick. He made a deal with the prosecution and agreed to testify against George at his trial. As a result of the deal, the prosecution dropped the death penalty. Noel was found guilty and received a life sentence with the right to parole after 42 years. But against George, there was only circumstantial evidence and Noel's testimony. The prosecution understood that George manipulated his homeless friend, who was not very smart to pull this case alone, but it had to be proven. Otherwise, the husband could escape responsibility. George had a good lawyer who presented his image to the jury as a heroic firefighter, an exemplary family man loving his wife and daughter. According to the defense, Noel killed Shauna out of revenge. She did not like him. She did not like him and was divorcing his friend, and George had nothing to do with it. Also, the defense insisted that Noel had a mental illness and saw hallucinations, so his words cannot be trusted. And after that, it was difficult to convince the jury of George's involvement, but the recordings from the store's CCTV cameras on which Noel and George were choosing a hammer together, as well as printouts of their calls, were very convincing. Although here the lawyer tried to prove that it did not mean anything. The men were allegedly just friends, communicated a lot, and bought a hammer for work around the house. George was amazingly calm throughout the entire trial, even when his best friend Noel testified against him. George's family, colleagues and friends insisted that he was a very kind and gentle person, never showed cruelty and violence towards anyone. They claimed that George adored Shauna and their daughter and could not have organized the murder of his beloved, but the jury did not believe it. 3 years after the brutal murder of Shauna, justice was served. George was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and first-degree murder. George's loved ones asked for mercy in sentencing, but it did not happen. George was sentenced to the maximum possible punishment, life in prison without the possibility of parole. George showed no emotion when the verdict was announced. His family did not agree with the court's decision and did not believe in his guilt. Shauna's relatives were happy with the verdict and believed that for him it would be the best punishment to sit behind bars for the rest of his days. Later, George tried to appeal, claiming that his lawyer was ineffective and ignored that his client had mental health problems. He was taking various medications that were clouding his mind. Because of this, George heard the voice of God ordering him to kill his wife to protect his daughter. So he did it, and the lawyer did not send him for a psychiatric examination. But the lawyer denied this and said that this was the first time that he had heard of George's mental health problems. His appeal was rejected. Shauna's 11-year-old daughter was left without parents. She lives with Shauna's mother, and her aunt Paula often visits the girl. Madison often thinks about her mother and, of course, misses her very much. Our video has come to an end. If you want to see more interesting content, subscribe to our channel and press the bell to not miss the new release.